Welcome to Modern Crimescope, the place where dark mysteries, shocking investigations, and chilling true crime stories are brought to life with gripping detail. Detective Harris thought he had seen it all, but nothing prepared him for the night baby Emma was rushed into the ER, gasping for air, with a rolled piece of coded paper shoved down her throat. As symbols linked to decades-old disappearances began to surface, Harris uncovered a trail of secrets that led straight back to a shuttered orphanage and a caretaker who refused to let the past die. The night was wet and heavy with rain when the call came through, sending ripples of urgency across the quiet halls of the hospital. A young mother, frantic and pale, had rushed inside carrying her infant who could barely breathe. The child's tiny chest rose and fell with desperate effort, each gasp a fragile attempt to stay alive. Doctors and nurses surrounded the baby, moving quickly, their faces a mix of focus and dread. They expected to find something ordinary blocking the airway. A piece of food, a toy, something a child might have accidentally swallowed. What they uncovered instead would mark the beginning of a case that no one could have imagined. As the instruments probed deeper, a tightly rolled piece of paper was pulled from the infant's throat, damp and wrinkled from saliva but still intact. The sight froze everyone in the room. This was not an accident. Someone had forced it there. The medical team unrolled the paper cautiously, hoping for some explanation. What emerged was even more unsettling. The strip contained strange symbols and numbers, written in a careful but erratic hand. It wasn't a child's scribble, nor did it resemble anything medical. It looked deliberate, as though someone had planted it to send a message. Doctors exchanged alarmed glances, aware that this was far beyond their expertise. They immediately alerted the authorities, knowing the discovery had turned a medical emergency into something darker. By the time detectives arrived, the hospital room had already taken on the atmosphere of a crime scene. Investigators questioned the mother, who trembled as she clutched her recovering child. She insisted she had no idea how the paper could have gotten there. The baby had been fine just hours earlier, sleeping peacefully in the crib. The detectives listened, but doubt lingered in their eyes. They examined the small bundle of paper again, noting its unusual texture. It came from a kind of notebook not commonly used, its fibers rough, the ink slightly faded. The thought that someone had deliberately placed it inside the child's throat filled the room with a cold weight. The lead investigator, a seasoned officer known for unraveling the most complex of cases, stepped forward. He understood immediately that this was not a simple crime. This was a message disguised as cruelty, and someone wanted it to be found. He ordered the room sealed, every surface dusted for prints, every item catalogued. Nurses and doctors were interviewed, their shifts and movements carefully logged. The baby's crib, the blanket, even the pacifier were taken into evidence. Nothing was too small to matter in a case that had already crossed into chilling territory. Whispers spread quickly through the hospital corridors. Staff members spoke in hushed tones about the baby with the secret in its throat. Some refused to go near the room, unsettled by the thought of such a deliberate act. The paper itself became a symbol of unease, its cryptic marks taunting investigators who knew they had only scratched the surface. Somewhere out there was a person capable of forcing a message into the mouth of a helpless child, and they had chosen this family for reasons still hidden in the shadows. Detectives left the hospital with more questions than answers. But the piece of paper was their first and only lead. The handwriting analysis confirmed that it belonged to no one in the family, and the symbols were not random scribbles. They resembled an encrypted code, the kind that would need expertise to crack. While specialists worked on deciphering it, officers turned their focus to the baby's home. The quiet suburban house, which should have been a place of safety, became the scene of a disturbing search. Every drawer, every corner, every hidden spot was combed for signs of forced entry or suspicious objects. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The family lived modestly, with no indication of secrets or strange habits. But as the investigators pressed deeper, a discovery sent a shiver through the team. Behind a vent in the nursery wall, They uncovered a small black device. It was a camera, carefully mounted and angled toward the crib. Wires ran down to a hidden power source, showing it had been installed with planning and skill. The mother denied ever seeing it before, her voice shaking as she realized someone had been watching her child. For weeks, maybe months, the infant's every movement had been under surveillance by an unknown intruder. The thought sickened everyone present. The camera's memory card was rushed back to headquarters, where the technical unit began combing through hours of footage. What they found was worse than anyone expected. In the dimly lit recordings, a shadowed figure could be seen entering the nursery in the dead of night. The intruder's face was always obscured by a hood, and gloves hid their hands, leaving no clear identity. They moved with unsettling calm, never in a rush, as if certain no one would wake. The figure leaned over the crib multiple times, sometimes placing an object close to the baby's mouth. It became obvious that the paper pulled from the child's throat had not been an accident. It had been placed there deliberately by this figure. Detectives replayed the clips over and over, searching for clues. The person seemed to know the house intimately. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or windows. It suggested either the intruder had a key or knew exactly how to slip inside without leaving a trace. The implication was terrifying. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was targeted. As news of the incident spread within the police department, the case was elevated in priority. The lead investigator gathered a task force, stressing the urgency. If someone was capable of sneaking into a child's room undetected, planting coded notes, and vanishing without notice, they could strike again. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen unusual activity. Most reported nothing suspicious, though one elderly neighbor admitted hearing faint footsteps outside her window on several nights. That small detail hinted the intruder had been watching not just the baby, but perhaps the entire family for some time. The discovery of the hidden camera transformed the investigation. This was no longer about a single act of cruelty. It was the start of a carefully orchestrated plan by someone who wanted to send a message through the most vulnerable victim imaginable. The paper in the baby's throat was only the beginning. The paper found in the baby's throat was delivered to a team of code breakers who studied every mark, every curve of ink. What appeared at first to be random shapes slowly began to take on meaning. The symbols matched fragments of a cipher that had been linked to a series of unsolved disappearances nearly 10 years earlier. Those old cases involved young adults who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind strange notes mailed to their families. The handwriting, the shapes, and the numbering on those letters bore a chilling resemblance to what had been discovered inside the infant. Detectives realized that the attacker was not just someone playing cruel games, but a figure tied to an older, darker history. The case that had lain dormant for a decade had suddenly been pulled back into the light through the throat of a child. The lead investigator dug through dusty files and forgotten evidence boxes from the earlier disappearances. He found a disturbing pattern. Every missing person had lived near a certain cluster of neighborhoods, and several of them had connections to the same orphanage that had closed its doors years ago under questionable circumstances. Reports from that time mentioned children running away, complaints about harsh discipline, and rumors of people who had worked there vanishing without explanation. Nothing had been proven, and the place was left to rot. Now, with the cipher resurfacing, the old orphanage became a focal point once again. Meanwhile, the technical team kept reviewing the nursery footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruder's face. The person's posture, height, and movements hinted at someone older, someone methodical. Their visits to the baby's crib were not rushed intrusions, but almost ritualistic in nature. The figure placed the notes with deliberate care, as though each act carried meaning far beyond what the paper itself revealed. Detectives wondered if the child had been chosen at random, or if the family was part of something larger, linked to the orphanage, or the earlier victims in ways that had yet to be uncovered. When investigators ran the mother's background, an unexpected connection emerged. Years earlier, she had lived in a town not far from the orphanage. One of her neighbors at the time had been among those who disappeared without explanation, their family receiving a coded note that baffled police. She had moved away soon after, building a new life, unaware that her past might be pulling her back into danger. This discovery was too precise to be coincidence. The intruder had chosen her child not just as a victim, but as a messenger, using the most shocking way possible to revive memories of crimes buried in the past. The more the detectives pieced together, the clearer the picture became. The coded papers were not random threats. They were fragments of a message, each symbol pointing toward something unfinished. The intruder was not simply tormenting families, but continuing a cycle of fear that had begun long ago. As the task force spread out to gather more evidence, the lead investigator realized that every clue pulled them deeper into a network of secrets stretching back decades. The attack on the baby was only one move in a carefully constructed game, and the past was clawing its way into the present with terrifying persistence. Only a few days after the shocking discovery in the infant's throat, panic spread once again. A baby from a nearby town was rushed to the emergency room with the same terrifying symptoms: choking, struggling to breathe, and on the verge of suffocation. Doctors acted quickly, fearing the worst, and what they removed from the child confirmed every nightmare the investigators had been dreading. Instead of paper, a strip of cloth had been shoved deep into the baby's throat. Stitched across it, in crude but deliberate thread, were the same strange symbols that had appeared in the earlier note. The horror was no longer isolated. It was a pattern, and it was spreading. Police scrambled to contain the news, but whispers escaped into the community. Parents clutched their children tighter, terrified that someone could enter homes unseen and attack the most innocent among them. The task force worked without pause, poring over both cases for overlaps. The families of both infants had no personal ties to each other, but digging into their past revealed an alarming link. Both sets of parents had once lived within walking distance of the same abandoned orphanage that had been at the center of suspicion years ago. This was not chance. Whoever was behind the attacks was circling back to that place, pulling threads that tied the victims together in ways few could see at first glance. Detectives returned to the orphanage site, though it had been sealed off for years. The building stood hollow, its walls crumbling, graffiti scrawled across its entrance. But inside, hidden beneath layers of dust and decay, they found signs that someone had been there recently. Old mattresses, food wrappers, and burned-down candles were scattered in a back room. It appeared to be a makeshift hideout, perhaps even a base for the figure-haunting families connected to the orphanage. On one of the walls, carved into the wood, were the same unsettling symbols from the notes. The discovery confirmed what investigators feared. The attacks were tied directly to this forgotten place. As the investigation deepened, a timeline began to take shape. Decades earlier, children had gone missing under the orphanage's care. Complaints of mistreatment had been ignored, files misplaced, and witnesses silenced. The building eventually shut down quietly, without a public scandal. But those who had lived nearby remembered the uneasy atmosphere surrounding it. Now it seemed the crimes of the past had never truly ended. They had only been buried, waiting for someone to bring them back to life. The community descended into paranoia. Families moved out of town, homes stood empty, and late-night patrols swept through neighborhoods searching for any trace of the intruder. The lead investigator ordered surveillance equipment placed in multiple homes, hoping to catch the figure in action. Officers worked shifts around the clock, determined not to let another child become a victim. Yet the intruder was always a step ahead, slipping like a shadow, unseen, but always present. Each new piece of evidence suggested the attacks were part of something larger, not simply acts of cruelty, but stages in a ritual that had been building for years. The coded notes, the symbols, the orphanage, they were all threads in a web that had yet to fully reveal itself. And the deeper the detectives dug, the more they realized they were not just investigating crimes against children. They were uncovering a long-buried secret that someone had gone to terrifying lengths to keep hidden. The evidence collected from the abandoned orphanage was enough to convince the task force that the intruder was not acting randomly, but deliberately retracing the history of the institution. Fingerprints lifted from the makeshift hideout inside the crumbling building were run through databases, and after days of waiting, a match came back. The prints belonged to a man who had once worked at the orphanage as a caretaker, someone whose name had vanished from records after the building was shut down. He had lived under aliases for years, moving from town to town, never staying long enough to draw suspicion. Now it was clear he had returned to finish what he believed had been left incomplete. Surveillance footage recovered from the hidden cameras in the victims' homes finally provided enough proof to link him directly to the intrusions. Though his face was often obscured, one frame captured his features as he adjusted his hood. Forensic experts compared the image to old staff photos, confirming his identity. The retired caretaker had not disappeared, as some had assumed. He had simply been waiting, watching, and plotting. His obsession was tied to the families who had once lived near the orphanage. Families he blamed for exposing whispers of abuse and neglect that eventually led to its closure. In his mind, they had stolen his livelihood, destroyed his reputation, and left him to fade into obscurity. Now, decades later, he sought revenge in the cruelest way imaginable, through their children. The task force launched a manhunt, combing through old addresses, storage units, and safe houses he might have used. Every lead seemed to dissolve into dead ends, but then investigators cracked the code stitched into the cloth found in the second baby's throat. The symbols formed coordinates pointing to a wooded area outside of town. Search teams rushed to the site and uncovered shallow graves hidden beneath layers of earth and brush. Inside were the remains of victims linked to the original disappearances from 10 years earlier. The caretaker had left the coordinates as part of his twisted ritual, ensuring his crimes would be uncovered, but only in the most horrifying way. The discovery shook the community to its core. Families who had spent years wondering about missing loved ones were now confronted with the grim reality. For the lead investigator, the graves confirmed what he had suspected all along. The notes were not just messages, but markers, clues designed to drag the past into the present. The caretaker's cruelty was as much about controlling the narrative as it was about taking lives. He wanted his story told through symbols carved into paper, cloth, and walls. After weeks of surveillance and tip-offs, police finally cornered the caretaker hiding in a derelict farmhouse miles from town. He was arrested without a struggle, as though he had expected it all along. In his possession were more notes, more coded strips, each prepared for families he had yet to target. The evidence was overwhelming, and his arrest brought an end to months of fear. Yet the damage he had inflicted could not be erased. The infant victims survived, but the scars left behind stretched far beyond their families. The town itself would never forget the horror of messages hidden in a baby's throat. The graves unearthed from the past ensured the caretaker's crimes would be remembered, not as isolated acts of madness, but as part of a chilling pattern of vengeance that had been decades in the making. For the investigator who led the probe, the case closed on paper, but the memory lingered as a permanent reminder that some secrets lie hidden in plain sight, waiting for the cruelest moment to resurface.